Okay, so hello. My name is Elise Dutelier. I come from the University of Ottawa. My research focus on the history of women's sport in Quebec. And I welcome you to this panel, which I'm sure will be very interesting. It is entitled Women's Liberation Movement à la Québec, Revisiting Narratives of the Second Wave Feminist Movement in Quebec. So each presenter will have between 15 and 20 minutes to present their research, and then we will have time for questions or comments. So I will now present the first presenter. So it's Geneviève Pagé. The title of her communication is The Seeds of an Intersectional Analysis, Québécoise debut, and the theorization of multiple oppressions. Geneviève Pagé is a professor of political science at the Université du Québec à Montréal. Her research focuses on the travelings of feminist politic theory across movements in the United States, France, and Canada. More broadly, she is interested in the development of theory through social activism and the use of theory by social movements.
Thank you, everyone, for coming. Okay, so I'm going to read my paper just because it's easier. So much like in the US, the 1960s and the 1970s were, in Quebec, a time of feminist revolt, a time where women recognized themselves as a social force capable of demanding changes in a society already in transformation. Gathering in small collectives, using direct actions, demos, occupations, and making their voices heard, radical feminists in Quebec created their own brand of feminism, one adapted to their own situation. For this paper, I focus on the work of two specific groups of radical feminists. The first one is called the Front de Libération des Femmes du Québec, or Quebec Women's Liberation Front, what I will refer to as the FLF for the rest of the presentation, which was created in 1969 when a number of feminists decided to regroup, think, and act on a number of issues, and, of course, overturn patriarchy. These women were already involved in political activism, either in Quebec separatist groups, in unions, or in Marxist or Marxist-Leninist groups. They organized in subcommittees, or what they called cells, and used direct actions. They also produced a journal or magazine. We can't figure out the proper translation for that, but something in between a journal and a magazine, called Québécoise debut, which means more or less Quebec Woman Rise Up. The committee that focused on direct actions disbanded fairly quickly, but the publication of the journal continued through 1974 under a different umbrella group, the Centre des Femmes, or what they call the Women's Center, which it was a women's center, but whatever. The other group I look at only published one document entitled the Manifeste des Femmes Québécoises, or Quebec Women's Manifesto. And I refer to this group as the MFQ, just because it's easier. This manifesto was published by an anonymous group of women who refer to themselves as Women from Montreal. And surprisingly, or not, I argue in this presentation that we can find in these productions the seeds of an intersectional analysis, even as those seeds did not flourish into a full theoretical framework like it did south of the border. In the wake of the debates around the place of an intersectional analysis currently happening in Quebec, I believe it is important to examine how this notion is not only imported from feminists coming from the United States, but also originally developed by local feminists trying to make sense of their own oppression. As a way to start the conversation, I will offer a summarized definition of intersectionality just to establish a basis for comparison. Second, I will provide some, although very little, information about the context of Quebec society in the 1960s to establish the existence of a third axis of analysis, that of colonialism against French-speaking Quebecers, or what I might refer to as francophones as well. Third, I will demonstrate how both the FLF and the MFQ have theorized what I call a proto-theory of intersectionality. Fourth, I will discuss a specific dilemma in applying the framework through coalition building. And finally, I will say a few words as to what it means for contemporary feminism in Quebec. I will not linger on the definition of intersectionality because I assume most people in the room more or less are familiar with it. The definition I use comes from the works of Black and Chicana feminists from the United States, not only Kimberly Crenshaw, but Patricia Collins, Bunny Thornton-Dill, the Combahee River Collective, the collection of texts in This Bridge Called My Back, as well as Gloria and Enzel Dua's work, etc. In short, I tend to define intersectionality as relying on three main premises. First, that oppressions are experienced simultaneously and that it is difficult to differentiate one from another when you live them. Second, that systems of oppression are mutually constituted and interact with each other while maintaining a certain level of autonomy. And three, that the consequence of that being that we must struggle against all systems of oppression simultaneously. We cannot prioritize one system over the other. Now, to give you a sense of the context of Quebec and to explain a little bit the construction of the third axis of analysis, which was the colonial axis, I'm going to summarize the history of Quebec in like 3 lines, so bear with me. So there was a time where there was a French colony. And then the English invaders came. Note my use of invaders. And that led to the creation of Canada, where there was a portion of French-speaking people that remained French-speaking people, and while most of Canada became English-based. Who's from Canada, just to get a sense? Okay, thank you. So you can have a complex understanding of this, even though I try to summarize it. So what remains is that there is a portion of the country which is French-speaking and Catholic as well. So in the 60s, Quebec was the theater of a renewed nationalist and separatist struggle against the dominance of English-speaking Canadians over French-speaking Canadians, or Quebecers. The domination of English Canada over French Canada was not only cultural and political, but also economically based. Just to give you some stats, in 1961, English-speaking Montrealers made 51% more than their French counterpart on average. And in a survey that came out in 1965, ranking the income by race, whatever kind of survey they make sometimes, the French Canadian race came out 12th out of 14. So it was, below pretty much a lot of other immigrants, which were from more recent immigration background. All of that to say that the French Canadians, at least in Quebec and Montreal, had enormous economic disparities with English Canadians. All of that to say that. So as a consequence of this situation, the renewed nationalist and separatist movement of the 1960s juxtaposed and merged belonging to a people, the Quebecers, and a class position, proletarian. And Marie-Andrée is going to talk a little bit more about the connection between Marxism and feminism. But what I'm really interested in is the way they were also inspired by Frantz Fanon, Albert Memmi, Aimé Césaire, and most of the anti-colonial and decolonization theories to construct the debate around the nationalist struggle in Quebec. And so the whole struggle was emerged in the language of third world decolonization. The history of referring to the French race and the English race, along with identification with decolonization struggles from third world countries like Algeria, Cuba, Palestine, led to theorization grounded in a racial identity. White Niggers of America, the title of a book by Pierre Valliere, aptly illustrates this phenomenon. Quebecers see themselves as not only second-class citizens, but also as slaves to the English masters and compare themselves with Algerian, Cuban, Palestinians, but also blacks in the US. Thus, the language becomes the marker of difference, which identifies not only belonging to a language group, but also a class and a race. Through these turbulent decades and up to the present moment, language remains in Quebec a fundamental marker of difference. And if you know a little bit about Canadian politics, you know that it's still very much an issue for different reasons. This language of decolonization became omnipresent among Quebec leftist groups in the 1960s, regardless of the focus of their struggle, be it workers, students, feminists, or others. And they provided the radical revolutionary framework from which feminists analyzed their situation and understood and created solidarities with other anti-imperialist movements across the world and against English Canadians. Thus, revolutionary feminists see the struggle for Quebec liberation as a decolonization struggle and perceive themselves as racialized subject, a problem I might address in the concluding remarks if you want to engage on that topic. But although problematic, this position nonetheless allowed Quebec feminists to develop a complex analysis of oppression. Thus, women from the FLF and from the MFQ established a basis for what could have become an intersectional analysis. It is interesting to note that, like Black and Chicana feminists on the other side of the border, these women are in the process of theorizing oppression from their own standpoint, one that does not seem to have much resonance in existing theories. Recounting the difficulty in finding literature that could help them theorize the multiplicity of their anti-oppression struggle, Marjolaine Péloquin, an ex-member of the FLF, says, open quotes, "It is extremely important to develop our own analysis. Thus, we are always searching for texts in French that stimulate our thinking and are in agreement with our line of thought. Because for us, Québécois, it is not easy to try to combine three kinds of struggle. Another difficulty is to justify theoretically why the feminist struggle should be first, meaning why it should be prioritized over the struggle for independence and socialism. Impossible to find texts that talk about that, and even harder in French. We see here a preoccupation with constructing an identity and a theory that would reflect the specific reality of women in Quebec. In fact, two of the three main, sorry, I'm just skipping because I go on and blah, blah. What is the conjunction of nationalism and feminism led to a certain understanding of the interaction and the complexity of multiple oppression, an understanding that led to what I call the proto-theory of intersectionality of oppression. The two main elements that I see in their work is first the idea that they will not prioritize which struggle they want to fight. And this is seen really all over the place, namely in the title of the first journal, which reads, "No Women's Liberation Without Quebec Liberation, No Quebec Liberation Without Women's Liberation." So right away, they're like, well, we're not going to compromise on either. Furthermore, they conceptualize the importance of fighting against both capitalism and patriarchy, which Marie-Andrée is going to talk a little bit more about. For example, in one of their journal, after a long expose positioning the nuclear family as the locus of patriarchal exploitation, they state, open quotes, "The liberation of women necessitates the destruction of the capitalist system and the nuclear family. One cannot happen without the other." End of quote. In other cases, they name all three systems of oppression as being the target of their struggle, all essential to women's liberation. Open quote. "The struggle for the liberation of women of Quebec must therefore be located at three levels: against patriarchy, against American imperialism and Anglo-Saxon colonialism, for socialism." End of quote. The second element that I think is important is not only the refusal to prioritize, but it's also the idea that all these systems interact with each other and have an influence in the way they shape the oppression. Here again, there are a number of texts which try to somewhat theorize this interaction. For example, members of the MFQ state, open quotes, we see that the patriarchal system, the patriarchal family, and the capitalist system, the division of labor exploitation, go together and are imbricated one into the other. Women who struggle against exploitation must struggle against the two systems. So in this quote, you have both elements, the one no prioritizing, but also the interaction. Furthermore, they recognize that this mutual interaction between all three systems when they write, open quotes, each of these exploitations are connected to each other and altogether they interact one with another. Although they keep saying that, they never really tell us how or why. I mean, there are instances where they try to, and they especially around the family and bridging capitalism in the family. But it remains pretty abstract. However, just like Black feminists in the US, they argue that there is some interaction and that there is some imbrication, and therefore we cannot consider the systems of oppression as completely separate. By 1974, the last publication of Québécoise debut, the development of an intersection analysis did not quite reach the level of a clear understanding of that interaction between the different systems of oppression. However, much like the Combahee River Collective text, for example, French-speaking radical feminists were able to identify ways in which it affected their lives in multi-layered and inseparable ways. Furthermore, as early as 1969, the refusal to prioritize one struggle over the other informed their choices of alliances and strategies. Because it's one thing to say that you don't want to prioritize, it's another to pick your allies and decide which struggle will be the focus of your struggle. So I then move on to looking at what are those alliances and when they create divides. And so it's interesting that actually it shifts in time. French-speaking feminists in Quebec, they really shift back and forth with their alliances, and you see some attempts to create alliances, and then they break away. So it's actually really interesting. In some contexts, the sisterhood and the commonality of experience with other women justified alliances with their oppressor, or who they consider their oppressor, the English-speaking woman. In other cases, alliances are broken. For example, in a letter sent to U.S. feminists, members of the FLF disavow a sister, Marlene Dixon, who is an American living in Montreal, and McGill, who was actually really instrumental in creating the women's movement there, but she was an American. And so they disallow her as a mediator between Québécois feminists and US-based feminists when they write in a letter, open quotes, we also want to specify our position towards Marlene Dixon and her friends. Marlene is a professor at McGill University, in bracket, Anglophone. She is not a member of Women's Lib of Montreal or the FLF. She has been living here for a year and a half and has never been able to communicate with us directly because she still does not speak French. Therefore, she cannot in any way speak in our name or in the name of any Québécois. Francophone women were clearly wary of uniting with Anglo-Canadian feminists, whom they consider both oppressors and sisters in the struggle. They were reticent to join in wider coalitions or nationwide attempts aimed at changing Canadian laws. They outright rejected any attempt to engage with the Canadian federal state on the basis that it did not legitimately reign over Quebec, thereby negating the possibility of a coalition with other feminists. As written in a collective statement regarding a national caravan for the decriminalization of abortion that was going on across Canada, they tell their sisters, open quotes, we refuse to demonstrate in front of a parliament whose power assumed over Quebec we do not recognize. However, we stand in solidarity with women of Canada because as women, we are all subject to the same oppression. So we see that they kind of play with this idea that they want to work with Canadian women, yet they don't want to work against the Canadian government because they're like, well, Canadian government, we don't think it's our government, so we're not going to work towards changing it. Similarly, within Montreal, the alliances were scarce and rarely successful. The revolutionary feminists of the FLF tried to navigate the lines between their desire to establish solidarity with women regardless of their origin and position in society and the difficulty of working with a group of women considered oppressive. After an original collaboration between the Montreal Women's Lib, which was an Anglophone group in Montreal, and the FLF, Francophone women pointed out that Anglophones' easy access to U.S. theories reinforced the existing unequal relationship between French and English, and consequently severed the ties between the two groups, even as they still shared the same space. Although this separatist decision needs to be contextualized, it's 2 months before the October crisis. We're really at the peak of the nationalist separatist movement. We see how the focus changed from woman-oriented to a Quebec-oriented struggle in a short lapse of time. The importance of this change in attitude cannot be underestimated, as it marks a split between the two communities that still goes on today to a certain extent. I'm going to conclude by saying that radical feminists in the 70s are trying to articulate the beginning of what could have been a three-way intersectional analysis. Yet these ideas never materialized into a clear framework or analytical tool comparable to what intersectionality eventually came to be, or what consubstantiality in French became. The idea that white Francophone Quebecers are racialized slowly lost its salience as a significant portion of them became the new middle class. The analogy with third world struggles became harder to substantiate, although nationalists still use the image of colonization in their discourse. Recognizing their privileged position on a global scale, contemporary feminists rarely use the analogy of colonization to designate the linguistic oppression, even though, as some might still argue, that it's present. As we move into the 90s, we see that economic preoccupation remains central to the feminist movement, although the use of class vocabulary kind of disappears. But issues related to race cease to be about white Francophone women and become about immigrant women, First Nation women, and women from other ethnocultural communities. The question that remains is whether this heritage and knowledge of the interaction between the different systems of oppression that was developed in the 1970s can be reactivated, shared, and used to understand and create alliances with women who do not share that heritage. And right now, this is a big debate in Quebec. So I invite you to join in and share your thoughts. But I'm done.
Thank you, Geneviève. And so now we will pass to Marie-Andrée Bergeron, who have a new title, which is Between Comrades, The Ethics of Marxism in Québécoise Debout. Marie-Andrée Bergeron is currently pursuing postdoctoral research at the Université du Québec à Montréal, with a fellowship from the Fonds québécois de la recherche et de la culture. Her research focuses on the creation of the figure of the intellectual through the women's participation in various Quebec journals between 1948 and 1968. She recently completed her PhD with a dissertation on the discursive analysis of feminist discourse in 3 feminist journals in Quebec, Québécoise Debout, Les Têtes de Pioche, and La Vie en Rose.
In his book Le poids de l'histoire, lecture, idéologie, société du Québec moderne, Professor Jacques Pelletier proposes to examine the 70s from a literary perspective by placing its products in the spectrum between the two poles that dominate that period, counterculture and Marxism. By using this approach, he identified in a certain way benchmarks in which it is possible to consider the literary space from a political, ideological, and aesthetic perspective, as suggested by the socio-critical approach he adopts. It is from those considerations that in this presentation we consider the 70s Quebec Feminist Journal, Québécoise Debout, in order to understand how it's favorably positioned itself both in the literary field and the intellectual field in Quebec during this particular decade. After broadly examining the general context surrounding the creation of Québécoise Debout, first, as I said, as Geneviève said, first by the Front de Libération des Femmes du Québec, then taken up by the Centre des Femmes du Québec, we will analyze the text of the introductory editorial in order to identify the traces of the Marxist ideology that it contains. If it's true, as proposed by Chaim Perelman and Lucille Brecht-Steka, that in order to truly convince someone, this person must, at the very least, be listening to you, the evidence suggests that the Québécois feminists responsible for the publication of Québécoise Debout have put in place in their texts some discursive and rhetorical strategies in order to target potential recipients, but also to find allies and comrades in battle. Comrades. It is the strategies that we'll try to identify during this presentation. Québécoise Debout was officially published between 72 and 74. The complete collection contains 9 editions publishing sporadically. The irregular publishing calendar is due to the fact that the writing depended on the level of involvement of the Centre des Femmes or Front de Libération des Femmes activists who were responsible for the journal. Québécoise Debout, as a self-managed, non-sponsored, and unsubsidized editorial initiative, was at first published thanks to the involvement of the editorial team. The only source of income came from the subscriptions. The marketing effort was limited to word of mouth, and the number of print ranged from 1,000 and 1,500 of this editorial situation. Ranged from 1,000 and 1,500. Because of this editorial situation, the journal was not widely distributed. In fact, it seems to be limited to the Isle of Montreal, even though women from all regions of Quebec could subscribe to it. Friends and family members were sharing their copies. The journal could reach a greater number of readers than the printing would suggest. Despite these harsh publishing conditions, Québécoise Debout was an organ that made speaking out a mode of action by reuniting around the periodical the Montreal feminist activists of the time. The first editorial of Québécoise Debout, entitled Lettre à nos camarades, Letter to Our Comrades, clearly defined the group's priorities, which could not take shape without the editorial intervention. The journal positions itself as the amorce d'une solution. Can you translate? The beginning of a solution. Creating a common space dedicated to breaking the isolation, and finding des moyens de lutte contre notre oppression commune. Indeed, the authors make a point of explicitly describing the journal as an organ where the sociability, the networks of Quebec's feminists could be established and developed. Quote, nous ne sommes pas à l'étape du mouvement de masse, mais à la création de noyaux de militantes formés politiquement, dont le rôle sera de sensibiliser d'autres femmes à notre libération collective. With Québécoise Debout, the goal was to create a journal focused on current events and on educating feminist activists that had already realized their state of oppression and that could be mobilized. It was necessary to convince them to take part in the movement by making explicit the underground mechanisms that cause the subordination of women via the assertion of a strong, monolithic nous, we, a nous, that acts as a unit that is expansive, all-encompassing, inclusive. I plus you. Je plus tu, vous. As outlined by Catherine Kerbrat-Orecchioni, but also via the publication of Histoire d'une oppression and Sexe et Politique, 2 regular columns that appeared throughout the life of the journal and aimed to teach Quebec feminism to novices. As is pointed out of the end of the editorial, the education and networking between feminist groups were 2 priorities of Québécoise Debout. Quote. Québécoise debout devra répondre aux besoins de femmes intégrées dans un milieu de travail, que ce soit dans un syndicat, dans un comité de citoyens, un groupe de femmes. Il sera un outil de travail pour la formation politique des militantes et un organe de liaison avec des groupes de femmes et des groupes mixtes et aussi avec des personnes travaillant dans les milieux particuliers. The letter to our comrades foreshadowed the 3 areas in which the Centre des Femmes intends to carry out its work: research, propaganda, and sexual health. Of course, the journal aims to publish the results of the research sector and the information documents concerning sexual health. The very structure of the Centre bestowed its function to the journal, the best suited medium of communication. Special attention must also be given to the work area to which the journal belongs, namely propaganda. Propaganda is an action directed to someone else in order to convince them of an alternate opinion, point of view, ideology. Why then did the propaganda sector decide to create a journal instead of handing out leaflets and prospectuses or writing a book? Most likely because, by its very nature, the journal offered options that other more static and less permanent discursive devices did not, including the armoring of important demands, current events, or reader loyalty. And because, according to André Fortin, create a journal is, in the Quebec of the 70s, for the intellectuals, a mode d'intervention dans le social. A way to intervening in the social. The collective publication aimed at positioning the Centre des Femmes as a political group, as Geneviève said, and thus integrating in the larger field of social struggles, as we mentioned earlier. Yet placing a journal as close to the avant-garde as was the case of Québécoise Debout resulted in the exploration of what André Fortin named the nouvelles formes de rapport aux politiques. The feminist, as is the case of other avant-garde movements, mostly countercultural and Marxist-Leninist groups, hope for promote a profound social change, a radical revolution. The feminists also show the other actors of the field that they support the fundamental ideologies that form the basis of the countercultural left movements, but they make sure to add feminism to the demands. Perelman and Olbrecht-Teka give a good analysis of this argumentation method. Quote, il arrive bien souvent que l'orateur est à persuader un auditoire composite réunissant des personnes différenciées par leur caractère, leur attache ou leur fonction. Il devra utiliser des arguments multiples pour gagner les divers éléments de son auditoire. Unquote. Québécoise Debout tries to reach its intended public, comprised of feminist women, but also of other intellectuals and writers of the time. Different elements, including approaching the social dimension of the world through the filter of a necessary revolution, show that the intellectuals of the times are held in the text. At least, this is what a rhetoric reading of the text reveals, using the theoretical notion developed by Perelman and Olbrecht-Teka. At the art of this undertaking is a marked desire to carve out a place in the intellectual community. But when building an implicit reader in order to meet the expectation of a certain readership, it is at the same time a way for the enunciator to reveal themselves. The authors of Québécoise Debout outlined the triple oppression of women, who were subordinate to capitalism, the Canadian state, and the patriarchy, which is reminiscent of the triad used by Parti Pris. It's an important, very important intellectual journal of Quebec. Which is reminiscent of the triad of used by Parti Pris for its slogan, indépendance, socialisme, laïcité. Independence, socialism, secularism. By basing the causes of women's oppression on the patriarchal structure and the capitalist society, the authors are aligning themselves with the audience they are targeting, which is composed of the same agents that help building this climate of speaking out, of revolution, in short, of avant-garde, to which they subscribe. On this matter, Perelman et Olbrelt-Tisteka add, la connaissance de ceux que l'on se propose de gagner est une condition préalable à toute argumentation efficace. A journal like Québécoise Debout is so close to the avant-garde leads to the exploration of the nouvelle forme de rapport aux politique. The feminists, like other avant-garde movement, counterculture, Marxist-Leninist mostly, hope for and promote a profound social shift, a radical revolution. They also show the other actors of the field that they support the fundamental ideologies that form the basis of countercultural left movements. But they make sure to add feminism to the demands. On this matter, the example of Letter to Our Comrades speaks for itself for various reasons. First, the title, Lettre à nos camarades, Letter to Our Comrades, reveals several elements that illustrate the rhetoric position of the enunciator. The letter is a particular means of communication. It is a mode of intervention that directly aims a person or a group. Consequently, this scène générique, to use Magnot's terminology, can you translate? Scène générique. Generic scene. To use Magnot's terminology, infer a recipient. The latter is referred to in the letter as camarade, which can have two meanings. The first pertains to camaraderie, or to a certain degree friendship. The second pertains to allies in the struggle, particularly members of a certain left-wing coalition. A first layer of ethos is perceptible. The feminists writing the journal and the recipients are comrades in a common struggle. The excerpt strengthened this notion work, another dialectics of Marxism, is promoted to win a common struggle, and in the text it is written. Il nous faut travailler. We have to work. The writers adapt their style in order to clearly express their left-wing affiliation, as shown by the lexical field related to struggle. They mention struggle, combat, but also oppression, emancipation. A second layer is thus added to the ethos. The writers show that they are aware of participating to other emancipation, national, social, economic, political, cultural, that are described in this excerpt, who was necessary to the emancipation of the woman by the use of the verb devoir, had to. La libération des femmes doit se faire dans le cadre de la libération nationale, sociale, économique, politique, culturelle. The women's liberation must be done. The precise choice of words suggests that the writers take into account their readership and try to convince and persuade the readers of the legitimacy of their speaking out. They align their struggle in a clear context and argumentative framework whose premises are directly linked to the ideas conveyed by the standard narrative of the group they are trying to integrate. Consequently, they establish a relationship, create a contact, to use Perelman's terminology, with a portion of the readership targeted by pro-independence or left-wing groups. The feminists of Québécoise Debout fill their speech with references to the Marxist ideology and target left-wing groups that are strong momentum at the time as their main interlocutor, as said Diane Lamoureux. Indeed, the feminists speak the language of the other, a language that helped them express the terms of women's oppression by considering them as an exploited class. Le Centre des Femmes is active on numerous fronts. The journal broach issues that try to explore the exploitation of women from all possible angles, but mostly that try to make sense of a reveal the structure that produce this exploitation by different rhetoric strategies and literary form as the letter to the comrades. For the feminists of the Centre des Femmes, the Marxist ideology is a lens through which they can define the opinions expressed in the journal, while on the political spectrum, they position themselves as the far left. This movement is nothing new to the experiences of the four founding members of the center. The interdiscourse is evidence of each author's intellectual path, of a political line, the term used by the Avant-Garde journal to refer to their program, that appeared to have been established before the creation of the center. The integration of the feminist struggle to the larger social struggle linked to the Marxist framework and that were firmly rooted in the field at that time become, in a way, a necessary rhetoric, since it helps training the successor based on the model of an exemplary feminist Marxist activist. Québécoise Debout was an organ that made speaking out of mode of action by reuniting around a periodical the Montreal feminist activists of the time. The Lettre à nos camarades, letter to our comrades, shows how the feminists of the Centre des Femmes relied on different strategies, namely branding their discourse, their text, with a semantic field functioning like a deictic, meaning that is better understood and takes out its meaning when read in the social and political circumstance in which the journal was published. From an intellectual point of view, their Marxist ideologies are not only present, they are also the founding element of the ideas expressed by the author of Québécoise Debout. It is both a resistance strategy and a way for the authors to invest the discourse that make their voice legitimate and subversive at the same time. Similarly, by appropriating the Marxist lexic for the benefit of the feminist movement, it is possible to integrate the movement in an established social and political struggle. This strategy includes women, feminists, in one of the greatest intellectual and political issue of the time, of course, but also in a literary field which is deeply marked by the Marxist lexicon and clearly its imaginary. Thank you.
Thank you, Marie-Andrée. So now we will go for Eve-Marie Lampron. The title of her communication is From Cannons to Bullets, the use of some, in bracket, women's liberation's classic text in Quebec's prostitution sex work battle. So Eve-Marie Lampron is currently a lecturer in feminist studies at Université du Québec à Montréal. She has recently received her PhD in history from the Université de Montréal. Her thesis focuses on literary women's networking in France and Italy in late 18th and early 19th centuries. Her research interests also include 19th century feminisms in Europe, as well as contemporary radical feminist thought in Quebec.
Merci, Elise. You hear me well? It's okay? Great, thank you. Well, in June 2013, the Canadian Supreme Court has heard plaintiffs Bedford, Lebovich, and Scott in a case challenging current regulation criminalizing closed house, procuring, and solicitation. In December 2013, the verdict was rendered. The Canadian government was allowed 1 year to change its criminal code in order to ensure the security of prostitutes / sex workers, acknowledging Bedford's claims, thereby striking down laws criminalizing prostitutes, sex workers, as well as pimps and clients. Of course, the challenge of Bedford against Canada has ignited the pre-existing rift between abolitionists and groups promoting the decriminalization of all activities related to the sex industry. In the wake of this renewed sex war, both sides retrieved theoretical work of the 60s, 70s, and early 80s women's liberation movement, whether to rely on its analysis or to criticize it. In a particularly surprising analysis by feminist scholar Viviane Namaste, published in the French language newspaper Le Devoir, the work of Simone de Beauvoir is instrumentalized to argue for the complete decriminalization of sex work. Similarly, Quebec abolitionist organizations and individuals have relied heavily on the work of Andrea Dworkin, Catherine McKinnon, and also Simone de Beauvoir to argue for the maintenance of regulation, criminalizing pimps and clients while decriminalizing women. In the following presentation, I will examine this process of relying on canons of the women's liberation movement as bullets in Quebec's 21st century public and feminist spheres, especially in a context where the stakes are high. First of all, it should be acknowledged that both sides of the debate agree on the necessity to decriminalize women and men offering sexual services. It's on the decriminalization of clients and pimps that the disagreements arise, prompting a virulent battle. On one side, feminist abolitionists promote what is called the Scandinavian model, which criminalizes junks and pimps while decriminalizing women and offering them ways to leave the prostitutional system. On the other side, the pro-sex work side, it is argued that criminalizing pimps and junks might endanger the security of women. For example, Bedford and co-plaintiffs argue that they should be allowed to organize into brothels to make women's work safer, and ask the courts to decriminalize the act of living of someone else's prostitutive activity, what is often labeled as proxenetism. Lately, this long-ranging feminist debate on prostitution sex work has gained prominence in the media because of the Bedford against Canada political and legislative case, thus engaging a larger segment of society. It is in this context that Viviane Namaste wrote the philosophy homework. The philosophy homework is a bi-monthly chronicle of an independent and intellectual newspaper called Le Devoir. The concept is that invited intellectuals, often academics of course, are asked to read a contemporary problem through the lens of the work of a great thinker or philosopher. For example, Le Devoir already published a piece where it was argued that Denis Diderot, editor of the famous 18th century encyclopedia, would now support the development of community-based ways of producing knowledge, such as Wikipedia. It should be noted that most of the great thinkers' pieces tend to focus on men. What a surprise. A remarkable exception was the use of Martha Nussbaum's work by philosopher scholar Ryo Chung to argue against Quebec's Bill 60, preventing people working in public offices to display any visible religious symbols, implicitly targeting Muslim women. That happens right now in Quebec. Namaste's piece in Le Devoir on Beauvoir and sex work speaks directly to the Bedford against Canada legal challenge. I here want to argue that Namaste's choice of Beauvoir as a pro-sex work poster girl is highly strategic, whether intentional or not, and for four main reasons. First, the importance of Beauvoir as a respected intellectual in Quebec. Second, the prevalence of existentialist and Marxist traditions in Quebec. Third, the perceived, and I might put emphasis on that, the perceived ambiguity of Simone de Beauvoir's views on prostitution/sex work. And fourth, Beauvoir's text lends itself to the use of classical feminist rhetorical strategies likely to appeal to our targeted audience. First of all, one should note that Simone de Beauvoir played an important role among Quebec feminists and intellectuals, starting up in the 1950s up until today, as illustrated by the name of the Simone de Beauvoir Institute for Women's Studies, Namaste's academic affiliation. Beauvoir's early writings, namely The Second Sex, are part of the few feminist publications available in French before the 1960s. The fact that a significant part of Quebec's intellectual elite studied abroad in France in the 50s, 60s, and 70s also allowed a familiarity with not only Sartre and Camus' ideas, but also Beauvoir's writing, partially explaining her celebrity among Quebec intellectuals and feminists, even before the renewal of feminist activism discussed by Geneviève and Marie-Andrée. Thus, members of the Francophone elite, the designated readership of Le Devoir, are generally familiar with this impressive woman. Second, Beauvoir's work exemplifies both existentialism and Marxism, two ideological trends also popular among Quebec intellectuals. Marie-Andrée already provided a significant example of the importance of Marxism in the early 70s feminist writings in Quebec. Yes, you did that. Moreover, as argued in Geneviève Pagé's thesis, which is called Feminism à la Québec, a very clever one, I might add, quote, the prevalence of existentialist tradition in French and Quebec societies is hard to quantify. However, the impact of Beauvoir's book on second wave feminism in both of these French-speaking societies was undeniable, for it constituted the main reference book. In the late 60s, early 70s, the rarity of translated American material rendered The Second Sex the primary text of Quebec feminism. Many even elevated it to the status of a feminist Bible, unquote. A statement also made by political scientist Diane Lamoureux. Third, Beauvoir is a respected figure in both camps of the prostitution sex work debate. Battle, I might say. Probably precisely because of the perceived ambivalence of her stance. In fact, Beauvoir's main concept that one is not born but rather becomes a woman highlights the difference between biological characteristics and the social construction of women, an idea central to constructivist feminisms, whether radical or queer, in France as well as in Canada and the United States. Furthermore, Beauvoir's critical stance on the violence of the state towards women's health and safety speaks to both radical abolitionists and pro-sex work feminists. Finally, the use of classical feminist rhetoric strategies in Namaste's text should be noted. Speaking of Beauvoir, she uses sentences of endearment such as, our dear Simone, our philosopher, thus inscribing her in a shared feminist and intellectual heritage. But what is more crucial is Namaste's appeal to solidarity and sisterhood throughout the text, conjuring feminists to stand side by side with sex workers in order to stop violence while using a rhetoric of unity. Thus, the divisiveness appears to come from abolitionists who are othering sex workers, according to Namaste. Quote, Beauvoir makes us understand that a feminist position only considering prostitution through the lens of sexual exploitation furthers a division, voluntary or not, between feminists and sex workers, end quote. Namaste also appeals to the creation of woman-run brothels, a space in which women could work together in a safe environment. This appeal to sisterhood and women's spaces is certainly aimed at convincing a feminist readership. Namaste's text is certainly unusual. Although she grounds her arguments in three classical Beauvoir texts, namely The Second Sex, The Ethics of Ambiguity, and the Manifesto of the 343, she starts by locating Beauvoir's stances against state control, in the case of abortion, transforming it into an appeal for the decriminalization of all actors in the sex industry. This intellectual leap between the criminalization of abortion and that of junks and pimps is quite spectacular. The use of classical feminist rhetoric is not solely the prerogative of Namaste. On both sides of Quebec's prostitution sex work debate, so-called second wave authors are mobilized. For example, the community-based Concertation of Struggles Against Sexual Exploitation, which federates abolitionist feminists in Quebec, as well as the Canadian Women's Coalition for the Abolition of Prostitution. Both use classical texts like Catherine McKinnon's work on prostitution in their testimony to the Supreme Court of Canada. Gail Rubin's later work frequently appears on the sex work side. Moreover, the Concertation of Struggles Against Sexual Exploitation refers to Andrea Dworkin's core work on prostitution and pornography, and even fundraised by selling the first French translation of Dworkin's Right Wing Woman, translated by Martin Dufresne here today. And of course, feminists on both sides of the prostitution sex work debate criticize the works and theories associated with the other party, in academic papers, books, as well as in feminist social media circles. But contrary to most dialogues amongst feminists, Namaste's text was well disseminated in the paper version of the newspaper, as well as in social media. Startled by Namaste's use of Beauvoir theories, and certainly compelled to retaliate against such a widely read analysis, Eliane Legauroy replied 5 days later in the same newspaper. Legauroy is a young political scientist and abolitionist feminist, but more importantly, the communication strategist of the Concertation for Struggles Against Sexual Exploitation. In her reply, Legauroy deconstructs one by one the arguments proposed by Namaste, trying to reassert that although Beauvoir would certainly be for the decriminalization of women in the sex industry, what can be seen as a feminist consensus, she would probably be against the decriminalization of Johns and pimps. It might not surprise you to learn that the exact same texts were used to argue this opposite stance. For example, Legauroy highlights passages in The Second Sex where Beauvoir defines prostitution as a form of slavery and presents a vision of Beauvoir's views on women and feminist solidarity far different from Namaste's. Although very well developed, Legauroy's response was probably written fairly quickly because she was trying to intervene in this legal and political battle before too much damage was done. The Concertation certainly sensed that Namaste's choice to use Beauvoir might tip Quebec's public opinion, hence prompting a quick reply. Interestingly, another reply was also published by feminist researcher Emma Lévesque. This freelance researcher single-handedly accused Namaste of tearing apart Beauvoir's work in order to promote her own agenda, and posited that Beauvoir really envisioned a world without prostitution. Namely, she quotes Beauvoir's Second Sex, quote, "In a world where men and women would be equals, erotic freedom would be socially accepted, but a sexual act will not be considered as a service that can be purchased," end quote. The core of my argument does not lie in defending or criticizing Legauroy or Namaste's appraisal of the work of Simone de Beauvoir concerning prostitution and sex work. Rather, it is relevant that even if so-called second-wave feminism is, wrongly of course, perceived as old-fashioned or antiquated, theories that emerged during the US women's liberation movement and its French equivalent, le Mouvement de Libération des Femmes, often remained central to important contemporary feminist debates in Quebec and certainly elsewhere. The example given in this paper further demonstrates how some of these authors are used as authority figures, especially on issues such as the current rewriting of the laws regulating sex work, prostitution, and touching the very core of the feminist movement. In a heated context, the use of an intellectual authority such as Simone de Beauvoir can prove to be effective. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Eve-Marie. We now have about 15 minutes for questions or comments. I'm inviting you to come and run and take the mic.
Take back the mic. No?
Yes.
I find it interesting that you spoke of Laclais as federating abolitionists in Quebec. I'd like you to document that or maybe talk about how Laclais is perceived and interacts with Quebec feminists.
Well, well, that's kind of tricky. Laclais, the consultation, if I'm not mistaken, was funded like 10 years ago, right? Okay. Sorry? 2008, so like 6 years ago, right? It started small by regrouping individuals and groups like wanting to oppose the sex work side of the debate that tended to define prostitution, define sex work as a work, as all the other kinds of work. Whereas the CLE, federating abolitionist feminists, thinks that prostitution is a kind of violence towards women. So it started small and it expanded. I think like right now the CLE federates like maybe 40 groups and more than 40, okay, like 50, 60 women's groups and more than 100 individuals, right? So that's for the CLE. On the other side, we have in Montreal Stella, which is a group of sex workers. How can we? That's kind of a tricky question. That defends the rights of sexual workers. And the relationships between Laclais and Stella are really explosive, intense, I would say. So the CLE started as offering like counter discourse to sex work, to the sex work discourse. But right now, the CLE also offers direct services to women involved in the sex industry and offers them way to step outside the prostitutional system and intervenes with women who want to get different jobs. And even hires social workers to attend women in their choices and their endeavors. So, does it respond? Yeah. Okay.
Yes, just take the.
So my name's Ashley Milbury. I'm a member of Vancouver Rape Relief, which is a member of the coalition of which you spoke against legalizing prostitution. We're an abolitionist group. Yeah, so we're very much in that explosive fight right now, and so I was just wondering. Well, thank you for first of all bringing that information here and applying how the thoughts of the 60s and 70s are applying now in often like conflicting ways. I thought that was really interesting. But I guess like to shamelessly like thinking about my own agenda, I was wondering if I could maybe get from you like names of academics or other women in Quebec that maybe we don't know, any abolitionist women that we should be connecting with and strengthening our movement.
Okay. We can certainly talk later.
Perfect. Yeah, and
about that. I
likewise,
would be
like
pleased to do so.
great, thank you.
I also spoke with Daisy yesterday of Vancouver Rape Relief, and she told me that you had recently a formation on Simone de Beauvoir as an abolitionist.
Yes,
actually,
yeah,
so,
and an Aboriginal woman as well.
yeah,
Because
right,
that's
so,
something that affects the community in Vancouver specifically, like a lot. Yeah, okay, that's great. And likewise, if anybody here is interested in that debate or, might know some academics that are even here maybe that, want to talk about this issue because it's one of the most important feminist issues in Canada at the moment.
I just want to point out that Vancouver Rape Relief has done tremendous work
to
help women and in the coalition of women against prostitution in Canada. So I want to acknowledge that. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay.
I was just wondering, Geneviève, if you could say a little bit more about, you mentioned that the movements that you studied were not interested in opposing the Quebecois government, the Canadian government. And I wonder if you could say a little bit more about that. What were they motivated to do, if not to, I can imagine all sorts of possibilities, but where did they put their energy, if not to
So I'm going to repeat the question for the mic. So what's your name? Susan asked that I mentioned the fact that they weren't invested in questioning the legal framework of the Canadian government or the Canadian government as a whole. And then you ask, so what were they trying to do, really? As I tried to demonstrate, they were really much involved in a separatist struggle as well. So they were invested in creating a Quebec government. And so the revolution for them was throwing out the Canadian government, creating a free Quebec with its own government. And so they had no interest in, well, especially in the early period, they had no interest in trying to reform the Canadian government because they're like, well, it's not going to last very long anyway, so why put effort into changing, a government that will be overthrown really quickly, which of course did not happen. And it's interesting. It's interesting to see actually how that discourse evolves through time, because early on it's that we will not engage kind of affirmation. Of course, as time moves on, it's more there are some of the women who try to invest, like the PQ or some of the Quebec organization who are trying to change the Quebec government. Others are like, no, this is all BS, right? This is not better. It's not by investing in the Quebec government that we're going to really overthrow patriarchy. So there's, that tension between, how do we reform the state? Do we change it? Do we get rid of it? Maybe you can say that. Some get invested in the state through the Conseil du Statut de la Femme, so the Quebec branch of the I don't know, it's an autonomous body, but that's state funded. The Conseil, I don't know.
Yeah, the National Association of Junior was the president of it, right?
The what? Sorry.
It's the national organization.
No. Not the national. No, it's a Quebec.
Oh, yeah.
It's the Quebec Women's Status of Women Council. Okay.
It's an advisory body to the government. Sometimes that also.
And they do research. Yeah, funded by it, but autonomous, right? So I mean, some then different feminists went in different directions. But at that moment that I was looking at, they were really and I mean, I think through the history, there's been attempts and refusal to attempts to work with Canadian feminists for different reasons, whether it's through the national, the NAC, or whether it's through informal groups. There has been times where people have tried to engage, and then other times they're like, it's not worth our effort and time. We should work on things that are surrounding us and that where we can have a real impact.
So do you think their assumption is that the separatist government would be better for women in a variety of ways?
Yes, and they invested in the separatist movement in a way that they are trying to force it to include women's demands, right? So it's not that magically it's going to appear. They are investing that movement for that reason. They want that government to create the space for women to be free, in a very simplified way. But that's, and that's what you see in their writing. They're like, but they also cannot see the overthrow of patriarchy while remaining in a Canadian colonial state, right? So it's all of these things are all, but it's the revolution will come, right? It's that idea, and at that, when we do the revolution, we want the woman agenda, the feminist agenda to be there, and so they're invested. But for them, the revolution is Quebec-wide. It's not, they're investing in the Quebec space.
It's not so much about Canada. I guess my question, if you don't mind repeating it, is, what would the women who published the journal have thought the role of their radicalized English Canadian sisters would have been? Like, what would they have wanted from English-speaking Canadian sisters that would be a non-colonial way to support the support the women struggling against not only patriarchy but all three forms of oppression.
And they've worked with those in Montreal. Like they have, and I mean, to tell the whole story, those groups were created because Anglophone women came in, talked to Francophone women, and were like, you need to organize as women. And they were like, no, we're busy with the Quebec's liberation and the unions and, what have you. And so they are aware of that, that heritage as well. And at times they work well together, and but I think as the separatist struggle becomes so omnipresent in Quebec, and I mean, I don't know how familiar you all are with Quebec history and the October crisis and the violence and the way the movement perceived itself and the way the government also repressed that movement, but it becomes, an Anglophone becomes the oppressor. And that's where I think at that moment they're like, we cannot work with you. I think that before that they were able to, and I believe that the Anglophone women were conscious of that and were trying to do everything to, well, maybe not everything, but I mean, they reached out to Francophone women. They knew that they could not create a real women's movement if it was only a bunch of Anglos at McGill who were gonna, lead the revolution, right? They were aware of that, but at the same time, they have more access to the text. They know where and that was a big issue in sharing knowledge and always depending on them to summarize the text for the others and trying to explain and feeling that you can't communicate properly and that you're always struggling to find your words and you look dumb and that plays out in personal dynamics as well. So, do you want to add?
No, that's good.
Is everybody here familiar with the October crisis? Raise your hand if not. Yeah,
okay.
Yeah.
Well, the October crisis is the moment where the Canadian government declared the War Measure Act to come in, and they arrested like over 500 people. That was after a few bombings and the enlèvement, the abduction, the kidnapping of one of the vice
Prime Minister of Quebec.
Vice Prime Minister of Quebec. Thank you, Marie, for the history. And so it's a really tense moment where both the radical separatist groups are really active. There's a series of bombings and what have you, and then there's the kidnapping, and there's their demands is read on the French CBC. As one of the demands they have is that their manifesto be read in the French CBC, and which is a national television. And unlike PBS, people actually watch it. So it's like the main way of communicating with the whole country, and so in French. So so that manifesto is read publicly on television, and it's like everyone's like, wow, it's revolution right now. And the Canadian government called the War Measure Act and came in and just arrested a bunch of people, and I don't know what else. You can talk about the history. You're the historian.
But it was just to highlight like the state of
the psychological state.
Yeah, between like Francophones and Anglophones back then, and I think it can explain like the profound division like in the early 70s between Francophones and Anglophones, a division that tends to like attenuate with the time. But nowadays, even in Montreal, I don't know if I'm pushing this too far, but I think like you have the Anglophone part of the city in Montreal and you have the Francophone part of the city. And both parts of the cities do not communicate that much one with the other. So yeah, there's still traces of this divide. Of course, as academics, we don't experience that divide as much, but we do as well. Yeah, you do. Wait, just go on with it.
No, it's not because people are mean or whatever. It's just there's different tradition. Like studying it in French, you don't read the same text that you do in English, and therefore it's sometimes it's hard to communicate with each other because we don't have the same framework, the same theoretical tools to explain oppression, we have a different language, we have a different way to think about the world, and that gets displayed in feminist debates a lot. And that's the topic of my thesis, so you are welcome to read it.
So just a quick follow-up, because you've been talking a lot about Montreal.
Yeah.
And I wonder if any of you have done some research of how these ideas were manifesting in more rural areas outside of the major center, or if you came across anything in your research that compared what it was like outside of the city where the clash was so dramatized.
In terms of the
In terms
English,
of the early feminist, like the women's liberation.
okay, because there are very few Anglophones outside of Montreal, so that clash is really, and in Ottawa, but
Francophone feminism.
okay, Francophone feminism
Yeah.
outside of Montreal. Well, yeah, there are organizations that are province-wide, like la FFQ, there are, but I wouldn't call them radical feminists either, right? Like you're asking about the radical in particular. I know there were some in Quebec City.
The second largest city in Quebec.
But I did not come across much. I'm sure there were tons of local initiatives. I don't know if anyone.
C'est quoi ça?
C'est des groupes de féministes radicales à l'extérieur de Montréal.
But a way to I'll try to say it in English, but as you see, I'm not very good. So I think that a way to know the new terms of the revolution and the women's liberation was by the text and the journal. I think that it was a way. I think I will repeat it. A way to be in the movement and to know what
What was happening?
So, but I don't think that maybe in Quebec City, but not in the other regions.
Because I very self-interestedly, in English Canada, what I found is that the journals would have disproportionately high numbers of rural subscribers.
Mm.
So you would have lots of people outside of the centers subscribing to the publications from the cities, because that was unlike if you were in a city and you had access to, like if you're in Quebec City, if you're in Montreal and you have access to other women who are radicalized, that the women in rural areas use journals in the same way, exactly what you're saying about how the text is an action, right?
Yeah.
And so I'm fascinated to see that, like you're saying, our traditions don't talk to each other, but it sounds like we wrote dissertations at very similar times, saying similar things, talking to our own linguistic communities, which is so interesting.
Je vais dire en français, tu vas traduire, OK? Ce qui est intéressant aussi, c'est que dans les textes, ouais, she will translate. I can say it in Spanish if you want. Dans Québécoise debout, dans ce journal-là en particulier, les actions qui sont relayées, c'est beaucoup les actions montréalaises, par exemple. Donc, la publicité qu'on fait autour des actions féministes, entre guillemets, ce sont les actions qui se déroulent plus particulièrement à Montréal. Donc, les syndicats dont on parle, ce sont généralement des syndicats d'usines montréalaises. On parle de des initiatives féministes comme la librairie des femmes, notamment, ou de certaines manifestations, ou de lieux où on peut se renseigner sur ce qui concerne l'avortement, sur ce qui concerne toutes les revendications prioritaires, disons, de ces groupes-là. C'est très montréalais. Alors, certainement que la manière dont Québécoise debout articule les termes de cette révolution-là concerne toutes les femmes, toutes les féministes de toutes les régions, mais les actions, disons, plutôt concrètes et les modes d'implication plus concrètes, ça concerne davantage Montréal. Mais il y a des appels de texte.
So what she's saying is that the way in Québécois that the direct actions are talked about, the ones that are, that are talked about, they are all coming from Montreal, and the way when they have connections with unions, it's Montreal unions, right? It's very self-referential. I mean, they could even argue, I'm adding this, for the liberation of Montreal, It could be, I mean, it's very Montreal-centric. She's talking about the women's library, the women's bookstore, even the Centre de Santé des Femmes, the women's health center. That's all in Montreal. And so what she's saying is the way that they try to talk to people, it is in order to reach a broader audience, but they talk to them in the language that's invested in their local politics, right? So, but I would ask if you know of maybe Martin, different local radical initiatives outside of Montreal, or
it's really how you define radical, because, for instance, the network of women's health centers was radical in the way they were describing self-abortion, for instance, and they were doing this to health centers throughout the province. The issue of violence against women was taken up by APAS, which is really the largest, the most well-implanted in regions federation in Quebec. But they were shying away from radical discourse, simply saying it's terrible to women are getting killed. And of course, the network of women's centers and associations has been fighting since the 40s and even earlier for the women's rights to vote. But that again was not formalized in radical discourse. But it was well implanted, and I'm really interested in what kind of journals were rural women reading in Canada, because probably there weren't these kinds of journals, but we could ask the women of Québécois de Bout and others if they did have outside subscribers.
So what she just whispered to me, because I mean she mentions the readership, and I asked, do you have more details about the readership? And she said I asked to get the their mailing list, their subscription list, and she's like, we don't have them, they're not archived anywhere. She said, but from talking to people who were involved in Québécois de Bout, they had a readership outside of Montreal, but it's not clear that it was. It's not. She wouldn't make. I'm saying she would make the judgment that you made, where it was mainly the readership was outside because the people in Montreal didn't need it. It wasn't like that.
Yeah, I wouldn't say it was mainly, but it was just
Yeah.
a remarkably high number,
Right.
because we have this kind of stereotype notion that it was the women in the cities who were talking about these things and interested in these things. But it kind of confirmed that there was also rural women who were incredibly. Anyways, I won't take up any more time.
Okay. Well, if there's no other questions, I think panel. Thank you to all our presenters. Thank you for you to have come. So, have a nice afternoon.